Please take attendance.
Chair Neely,
Here.
Representatives Farhat,
Here.
Brixey,
Here.
Carter,
Here.
Witset, Grant,
Here.
Price,
Here.
Van Workum,
Here.
Markkinen,
Here.
Fink, Outman, Tisdale.
Here.
Madam Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you. Vice Chair Van Wincom, make a motion to accept the minutes from February 1st, 2023 meeting. Without any objection, the meetings are adopted. For today, our agenda we will have a presentation, a brief overview of SIRES from Jim Stanswell and FHA Associate Director and Senior, and Ben, Associate Director. Can you guys please come up to the table? And it's Ben Jerker.
Ben's gonna let me fly solo.
Let you flex along.
Yeah.
All right.
Committee. As you mentioned, my name is Jim Stansel. I'm Senior Economist and Associate Director with the House Fiscal Agency. Ben Gilchek, sitting behind me, is also an Associate Director and will soon, at some point, become the Senior Economist. I've been telling people that I'm going to retire for the last 2 years, and I'm still here. But I think at some point it comes to an end. So anyway, Ben will be a very familiar face to you in the future. So I will leave it to your discretion as far as questions are concerned. I'm happy to either take them on the fly or wait till the end, whichever you prefer. Whatever works out best for you. So.
We'll wait to the end.
All right. So, for those of you who saw the revenue conference, attended, or either watched it later on, I'm going to go through kind of a brief overview of what was discussed then. We went through some of our economics. We spent more time focusing on the revenues, but this is just kind of a quick overview of what our consensus economic outlook looks like. And for this table and all the other ones that are similarly structured, 2021 is final data. 2022, for some of the economic data is final. For other parts of it, for example, GDP, it's still preliminary. And then 23 through 25 represents our consensus estimates. The big takeaway from this table, and I'm not going to go through all the numbers, but in general, we are looking at a slowing economy that'll pick up in the out years, but things aren't all that bad. We're still having positive real GDP growth on an annual basis. We're looking at light vehicle sales that are increasing from about 14.9 million in 23 to 16.4 million by the time we get out to 25. Now that's a far cry from the 17 plus million that we were through the latter part of the 20 teens, but it's certainly better than we were during the pandemic. Inflation is expected to start going down fairly rapidly from 8% in 22 down to 2.7% by the end of the forecast horizon. And I don't know how many people in this room were around in 1980 when the inflation rate was 13.5%. So while 8% is clearly historically high, it's certainly not the worst we've seen. So, and the other thing is the inflation of the late 70s and early 80s lingered for a while. So the fervent hope is the Fed attacks the inflation rate with higher rates, and it does come down as quickly as we've forecast. On the Michigan side of things, wage and salary employment growth is expected to remain positive throughout the forecast horizon, slowing considerably from where we were in 21 and 22, but continuing to grow. And a couple lines below that, if you look at wage and salary income growth, again, it's slowing, but it's still staying relatively robust. We're still seeing, despite not a lot of employment growth, we are seeing wages and salaries increasing, and that's indicative of the relatively tight labor market right now. And then finally, much as with the United States, we're seeing the inflation rate drop in Michigan, not quite as quickly, but still down to the mid 2.5 range by the end of the forecast horizon. This represents what our forecasts looked like going out for gross domestic product. We didn't actually present this, and this is not a consensus. The red line is actually just our agency averages. We don't actually come to a consensus on a quarterly path. We did not know the final quarter of 2022, kind of the light blue bar. So if the average of our forecast was about 0.5% growth. The first reading came in at 2.9%. The second reading came in at 2.8. There'll be one more final reading for the fourth quarter. But needless to say, the economy is stronger in the fourth quarter than we would have projected it to be. As a result, the short recession that we were projecting, you can see where the red line drops below zero, we were projecting roughly a three-quarter recession, but it wasn't going to be very deep. The way the data looks now is that's probably going to get pushed out a little bit, that we still may see a recession. The likelihood that the Fed can engineer a soft landing with no recession whatsoever is still kind of up in the air, but but now, to the extent that we do go into a recession, it'll probably be to the latter part of 23 and maybe lingering into 24 a little bit more. But the uptake of all of this is, it won't seem, if it does indeed turn out to be this way, it won't really seem like a recession, at least not what we've seen in the past. Certainly not like the Great Recession from 2008. This is very mild. I mean, the lowest negative growth rate is 0.5%. That's pretty small. And while it would fit the Econ 201 version of a recession of 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth, the agency that's actually in charge of dating recessions, the National Bureau of Economic Research, they look at a broader set of factors. And so it's possible that a year and a half from now, they will say, well, there really was no recession, because they also look at things like employment growth and wage growth. So it'll be interesting to see how all this shakes out. But regardless, we're not anticipating a very deep recession. So that's all the economics I'm going to bore you with. The rest of the presentation will focus on, for the most part, on revenues. And you may have heard somewhere along the line that 22 came in a little bit stronger than we'd anticipated back in May. In fact, to the tune of about $1.5 billion when you look at the general fund and school aid fund combined. The sales taxes were up about $485 million over what our May estimate was. And again, these are preliminary numbers. We don't know because we haven't had book closing yet. Income tax withholding, the major component of the individual income tax, is up about $100 million, and corporate income taxes were up about $200 million. So combined, just those three alone constitute over 50% of the $1.5 billion that we think that we're up from May. This just looks at the average annual growth rates of sales and use taxes year over year. And you can see it kind of floated along in the 3 to 6% range. Yeah, it dropped down to a little bit below zero in 2015. But for the most part, there weren't very many wild gyrations until, one, the pandemic hits and the bottom falls out. And then the response to the pandemic, with all of the federal government support and everything that goes with it, and we're seeing 18% growth rates in sales and use taxes. It's absolutely unheard of. And so back in May, we were projecting that was going to drop to 7.2%, which is a big drop, but it still would be the second highest number on that chart. Well, we didn't quite get there. We had a growth of about 11.2%, or at least that's what the preliminary number would look like. And so when you translate roughly 4%, an extra 4% growth on a $10 billion number, that's how you get $485 million in sales taxes that were up. Similar picture with withholding, and again, withholding is one of the facets of the individual income tax, but it's far and away the largest. And so we've got a little bit more variation in withholding growth year over year, but going into 21, yeah, there's a slight drop down to 5.1%. We think it's going to be 8.2% in 22, And lo and behold, it's 9.1%. So again, we undershot that amount, given that the withholding number is about $10 billion, 1% of that, there's your 100 million. This table is now looking at combined business tax revenue. It excludes insurance, but it's looking at the Michigan business tax and corporate income tax, and it's excluding any of the mega credits, the certificated credits that firms can still file for under the MBT. So this is just looking at net revenue coming in the door. And you can see that for the most part, it's floating around in the 1.1, 1.2 billion range. There's a little bit of a bump in 2019. And then all of a sudden, it skyrockets in 21 and 22. It grows significantly in both years. Our view is that that's not sustainable, but it's showing how well corporations and businesses did during the pandemic, with the federal support that they received and the fact that consumers were still buying. And in fact, consumers, one of the things we noticed with sales taxes, and I'll come back to this a little bit, but consumers stopped buying a lot of services since they were unavailable. Services are generally untaxed, and they started buying tangible goods, which for the most part are taxed. And so that's one of the things that really goosed our sales tax revenues. And so this is kind of our last mea culpa chart on 22. So if you look at the very first bar on the left, that was our first estimate back at the January 2020 revenue conference. And we were projecting about $26.2 billion for combined school aid and general fund revenue. And what this is showing is how those estimates changed over time. And by the way, it's not unusual at all for the numbers to change over time. Back in January, we did our very first estimate of 25. I'd be surprised that when the books close in 25 if we hit it exactly on the nose. Things are going, there are certainly things that are out there that we can't foresee. But obviously COVID hit, the bottom kind of fell out in May. We brought it down by to 24.1 million. We had a special revenue conference in August because things were so uncertain, and we brought it up a little bit. We were starting to see some of the federal stimulus hit, and things maybe weren't looking so bad after all. And at every subsequent revenue conference, we kept revising it up, and then finally, by the time you get to May of 22 or 21, excuse me, you're actually back to basically where you were to begin with, and it continues to grow. Back in May, didn't mean to do that. Back in May, we were at $31.5 billion combined, and when we revisited this last January, we were at $33 billion. That's the $1.5 billion right there. So I would point out, and we've made these comments before, $1.5 billion sounds like a lot. The appearance is that's a big swing and a miss. But on the other hand, that's 95%, or it's only 5% more from what we were seeing in May. So it's a big difference, but it's also on a very big number. And so, the way I like to look at it is, well, we were 95% right in May. We just weren't 100% right. So that was our talking point. So at this point in the revenue conference, what we typically do then is look at our major taxes, the ones that contribute most to the school aid fund and the general fund. We always assume current law. We don't assume that certain things are going to become law. We then differentiate between baseline growth rates, which are economic conditions and only the economics, and net, which incorporate policy changes. So we start out looking at baseline. What does the economy suggest this revenue stream should be? And then we make any adjustments to it based on federal tax law changes or state tax law changes or other things that may have occurred. So when we talk about baseline versus net, that's the difference. So with baseline income tax growth, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but basically the 12+% growth you were seeing in 22 for income tax as a whole was just unsustainable. We couldn't continue that way. And as a result, we were all forecasting a drop in 23, and we agreed on 3.7%. Now, within that negative 3.7%, withholding is still continuing to go up a little bit within that number. Withholding is expected to go up by 1% or so, but annual payments and quarterly payments are expected to drop substantially, and that's where you're seeing the negatives. And the annual and quarterly payments are generally from things like capital gains, dividends, things that, whereas withholding is wage and salary income. It's pulled out of your paycheck and it's sent in. So the annual and quarterly payments are kind of those reconciliation payments that you make if you have other forms of income on the side. So when you look then at the net income tax estimates, so these are actually the dollars in the door. One thing I would tell you to note right away is if you look at the left-hand scale, it's only going down to $13 billion. And I did that to kind of accentuate the difference in the bars. But if this went all the way down to zero, these bars would look very close to flat, other than the drop from 22 to 23. But we're seeing about a 2.9% drop between 22 and 23. Seeing positive growth return in 24 and 25 to the tune of about 3% in 24 and 4.3% in 25. Baseline sales tax, very much the same story, if not even more so than the story I just told about income taxes. The growth rate of 14.6% is just not sustainable. Consumers are switching back, purchasing more services, purchasing fewer goods, or at least in relative terms, and a lot of the stimulus money is wearing off. And so the strong household balance sheets that we were seeing during 21 and 22 aren't carrying forward as much into 23. So we're seeing, very modest, there we go, sorry. Very, very modest baseline sales tax growth. And when you convert that into numbers, again, I would caution you to look at the scale on the left-hand side, because these bars, again, would look fairly flat, especially the difference between 23 and 24. There's only 0.1% growth between 23 and 24. This is just something to ponder as we try to figure out whether or not we have really any idea of what we're talking about or not. And I don't mean to be quite so glib about it, because we do put a lot of effort into this, but there's a lot of uncertainty right now. And so what this is showing is combined sales and use taxes, back in time. The red dashed line is a trend line that just kind of fits those bars up to 22. And yeah, we dipped below the trend a little bit during the onset of the Great Recession. It took us a little while, but we finally got back to trend. And then the offset of the pandemic hit, and we saw revenues jump in 21 and 22. So the question is, what happens thereafter? Do we revert back to the trend and drop all the way back down? Do we continue to grow from where we were? Or do we just kind of assume, well, maybe 21 and 22 are setting a new trend? And that was kind of the option that we picked as we were talking about our various consensus estimates, is we are carrying through in 23, 24, and 25. You can see those three light blue bars are all above the long-term trend line, but they're relatively flat compared to 22. So we're not seeing a big fallback in sales and use taxes, but we're also not seeing a lot of growth from what we would have projected in previous years. This just looks at combined MBT and corporate income tax revenues. Now, this does include the impact of the certificated credits, so that's why these numbers are so much lower than the previous chart showed. And so when you factor in the certificated credits that firms can still file for, it does reduce the combined revenue by the tune of 450 to about 500 million per year. It does start dwindling a little bit as you go forward. The thought is that the credits will be completely exhausted by maybe somewhere 2032, 2033, somewhere in there. But when you factor in the credits, we're not seeing a lot of growth in MBT and CIT revenue. And then finally, the last individual tax piece we'll talk about is the state education tax, and that's because it's such an important component of the school aid fund. And this is pretty straightforward. It's a 6 mil property tax. It's constant at that rate, and it's times whatever the taxable value is. Now, the taxable value, as per the Constitution, growth in taxable value year over year is either the rate of inflation or 5%, whichever is less. Well, when you've got 8% inflation in 1 year, you know that taxable value growth is going to be capped at 5%. But one thing to keep in mind is that the effective inflation on the state education tax is kind of lagged, because the inflation that we see in 1 year doesn't affect the change in taxable value until the following year. And even then, it's spread over a couple of fiscal years, because the summer taxes occur in one fiscal year, but your winter taxes occur in the next fiscal year. So that's why you continue to see these bars going up, even though we see, we project that inflation is going to be coming down. It's because that one burst of inflation that we saw in 22 is going to have some lingering effects going through. So at this point, we can put all the pieces together and look specifically at the general fund and school aid fund. And this is just showing you the components for fiscal year 23. Again, this is an estimate. This was our consensus estimate for the general fund. And you can see the three big components, the individual income tax, sales and use taxes, and Michigan business and corporate income taxes are the three big players here. Those three alone comprise 91% of general fund revenues. The other pieces are there, but they're not particularly large. Somewhat unusually this year, non-tax revenue is a little bit higher than it normally would be. That's typically, the big piece of that is typically the transfer from the liquor purchase revolving fund. It's being boosted this year in 23 because of all the interfund borrowing interest. As interest rates have risen, funds are able to accumulate more interest, and so that's being picked up in non-tax revenue. The other government or the other GFGP taxes are relatively small. Those are things like oil and gas severance and the essential services assessment. And you can see that the tobacco tax and beer and liquor taxes really only comprise about 2% of the total. And so that was the first light bar there, the FY 2022-23. You can see that there's a substantial drop again from 22 of about 2.8%, and then GFGP revenue starts to grow after that by about 2.1% and 3% by the time we get to 25. Very similar picture for the school aid fund. If you look at sales and use taxes, the income tax and SET, you're looking at about 86%. You throw lottery in there, and you're at about 92.5%, almost 93% in 23. A couple things I would note. Treasury made the announcement yesterday that they were sending $60 million out to local governments for the marijuana revenue. The school aid share of that in 23 is expected to be about 80 million. Again, which is nothing to sneeze at, but it's a relatively small portion of school aid revenue. And in part because I haven't checked this in the last year or so, but when Michigan legalized recreational marijuana use, we did so at the lowest tax rate in the country. So while the base may be relatively large, the tax rate is small and is relatively small, and we don't pick up as much revenue from it as some perhaps might have thought. The iGaming piece is there. That with sports betting and fantasy, 90% of that, if not more than that. Ben follows these numbers more closely than I do. But the action here is in iGaming. Sports betting is not that large. Fantasy is rounding error. And one of the concerns about that when it came in, and it's kind of a similar story, is how much will that scavenge from casino revenue and from lottery, both of which also go to the school aid fund, but have higher tax rates. So the iGaming is actually taxed lower than if you walked into the casino and did exactly the same thing. So there's some concern that there may be some cannibalism one way or the other from those. Again, going forward with these numbers, we're looking at about a 1.1% drop between 22 and 23, growing by about 1.2% in 24, and then 2.3% as the economy picks up and the labor market remains strong. School aid fund revenue will jump by about 2.3%. And I won't go through all the numbers in this chart. This just combined, the percent changes I just gave you are all in this chart along with the dollar amounts. The point I would make from this chart is, in between 22 and 23, you're looking at negative growth rates. But you're also up about 1.2 billion from where we thought we were going to be in May in 23. And that 1.2 kind of pretty much carries over into 24. This was our first attempt at 25, so we don't have a May comparison for 25. But the 1.5 billion that we were seeing in 22 looks as if a good portion of that will be carrying forward into 23 and 24. Not growing, but it's also not falling away either. The next two tables are for your edification only. It's just the detail behind the final 21 numbers, the preliminary 22 numbers, and then our consensus estimates for 23, 24, and 25 for the major taxes for general fund and school aid. And if you have any questions about those, feel free to contact me, and I'd be happy to go through anything. Hopefully there are no typos, but if you find them, let me know. It's a lot of numbers for me to type. So the only other three provisions that we're required to do from the Revenue Conference are, one, calculating budget stabilization fund pay-ins and payouts. And as we always point out, the calculations are only recommendations. They cannot mandate an appropriation. And in fact, deposits and withdrawals to and from the budget stabilization fund have to be appropriations. The constitutional revenue limit determines whether or not state revenue from all sources exceeds 9.49% of personal income. And then finally, the income, we'll talk about about the income tax trigger. That happened the very first time for 23. And we'll talk briefly about how that's calculated. So very quickly, as far as the BSF is concerned, if adjusted personal income growth, and it's adjusted for transfer payments and inflation, if that's negative from one year to the next, that suggests that you can make a withdrawal from the budget stabilization fund, and that withdrawal can be up to 25% of the prior year balance. If growth is between 0 and 2%, there's no pay-in or no payout. If growth exceeds 2%, then the amount that exceeds 2%, so if we have 3.5% adjusted personal income growth, then the amount above 2%, 1.5% times general fund revenue, would suggest that's what your pay-in to the BSF should be. But again, it requires an appropriation, and the statute can't mandate that. Based on our calculations, there would be no pay-in or payout for 23, 24, or 25. So after going through all of that, I just kind of told you, we're not doing it after all. So right now, the BSF at the end of 22 is just shy of $1.6 billion. The governor has recommended a $200 million deposit in the fund. If that does take place, and you look at projected interest payments, by the time we get out to 25, it would be about 2.1 billion, or roughly 6.2% of combined general fund and school aid fund revenue. There's a provision in the law that says it cannot exceed 15%. Obviously, we would be substantially far away from that. The constitutional revenue limit, I'll try to run through this fast, I'm sorry, is just it's simply put, it's 9.49% of personal income, although personal income is lagged in these calculations because we don't know what it is since it takes a while for the Bureau of Economic Analysis to publish personal income numbers. So we lag the personal income, take 9.49% of that, and that's the upper bound. We cannot bring in any more revenue from that, from state sources. Well, we can exceed it by 1%, but if we go more than 1% over that, we have to return it to the public. When you look at revenue subject to the limit, so this would be the general fund, school aid fund, transportation revenue, permits, fees, anything that's coming, anything that the state government gets from its own sources, but would not include federal revenue, for example, or that type of thing. When you look at what our projected revenues subject to the limit would be, you can see that would be under the consensus or the constitutional revenue limit by about $11 billion in 23, dropping a little bit to $10.4 billion in 24, and then going back to about $11.8 billion below the revenue limit in 25. And understand this is an interaction of a couple things. It's the growth of personal income, and it's the growth of revenue to the state. For example, we see personal income going up by 4.6% between 22 and 23, or at least that's our projection. We're seeing revenues grow by about 2.4% between those 2 years, the revenue subject to the limit. So as a result, the revenues aren't keeping pace with personal income. That's why we fall further away from the revenue limit in 25. So it's both factors. It's not just the taxes are going down, because clearly they're going up in 25. They're just not going up, or I should say revenue, not just taxes. But revenue's going up in 25. It's just not going up as quickly. And this is just kind of a cute little chart. The solid red line horizontally shows you the 9.49 limit. Of personal income, and then the solid black line shows where we've been historically. There was the bump in '94 when Proposal A became law, and then we jumped up again in 2000. Things were fairly flush back then. I started House Fiscal slowly after that, and then we went into a single state recession. I don't know if I'm responsible or not, but so. And then after that, you can see we've fallen further and further away from the revenue limit. And last but not least, the income tax trigger. So the income tax trigger is always based on FY21 GF revenue, and then it's adjusted for cumulative inflation times a constant of 1.425. In any following year, so for 22, you look at 22 revenue, you look at how that compares to the capped revenue, 21 times any cumulative inflation times 1.425. If it exceeds that amount, then that would automatically trigger an individual income tax rate cut. If it doesn't, then we go on and we look at it again the next year. We did not make any evaluation of this at the revenue conference in January because the law specifically states that it has to use general fund revenue as reported in the annual comprehensive financial report, and that has not yet, the books have not yet been closed. So rather than speculate on something and throw a number out there and then have everybody get wedded to it, since we don't know how the books are going to be closed, and I'm the first to admit I'm an economist, I'm not an accountant, and the book closing process has always been a big black box to me. So I don't pretend to try to understand it, but I know the accountants work on it, and then they let us know. So once the books are closed, we'll be able to make that determination. But until that happens, we're in kind of a wait and see mode. So last but not least, I want to do a couple shameless plugs. If you do not have a copy of this, our revenue source and distribution, I recommend that you go to our website and either download it or contact Catherine Bateson in our office and ask for a paper copy. Now, I will say I'm in the process, just starting now, of updating it for the revenue conference, but it shows final revenues for the last year, the current year revenue, and then the next revenue year out. It gives you nice handy pie charts. It tells you what all the pieces are, where it goes, where it comes from. And so it can be, it can be helpful to your offices in when you get questions like, does the lottery money really go to the schools? Yes, it does. And so, we're always happy to answer your questions, but this is just it's a very convenient resource. A second one is if you go to our website and look under budget briefings, there's a state tax overview that's similar to what I just ran through, although it does at the end go through some of the major taxes and looks how they compare to personal income and things like that. So that I just finished updating. I don't know if it's on the website yet, but it should be there quickly. And last but not least is our budget poster, which many of you may have seen. This is a labor of love Mary Ann would not want to be happy with me for that, but thank you. But this is a very, very comprehensive but condensed view of where the revenue comes from and where the revenue goes. So with that, I will turn it over to any questions you might have. Sorry for going a bit long. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much for coming in and giving us that presentation. So do anyone have any questions? Okay. We have Rep. Van Welcome that would like to have asked a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate your presentation here. Looking, I guess, on how you develop these models and maybe some of the trends happening in the future. It seems every January I get a lot of briefings from economists of what's happening in West Michigan, what's happening in the state. What are some of the trends that you are watching as you look towards the future? A lot is the demographics and the population growth in the state, but I also read something in the Wall Street Journal of just how a lot of people want part-time work and are not doing full-time work, and the impacts that may have in the future. What are the trends, I guess, that you are looking at, House Fiscal is looking at, and the state's looking at as we move forward?
Thank you. Excellent question. We're listening to a lot of the same sources I'm sure that you are. One thing I was remiss in is one of the things that was also handed out to you is just a little fiscal snapshot. This kind of goes through our consensus process. I wasn't going to talk about it. If you have questions, you can certainly contact me. But this is kind of how we go about preparing the consensus estimates. Looking forward, no, I think, quite frankly, I think you've hit the major one is the demographics and the labor force participation rate. We are going to need to see an influx of labor into the state of Michigan, regardless of where that comes from, because the labor force participation rate has stayed relatively low. It dropped during the pandemic, and it's not coming back at the same way that we're seeing it at the national level. It's lagging behind. And whether or not it's flattening out, as you pointed out, maybe people that have either retired early during the pandemic and just said, I'm not coming back. People who said, well, I'm going to do part-time work and I can do it remotely now. And that's an advantage to me. That's one of the reasons why we're seeing currently a tight labor market, and why I think that if you go back to the very first chart I showed with the employment growth, it's not great during a recession, but it's not negative. And so at least during our forecast horizon, we're hoping that the labor force participation rate picks up a little bit, but that's not really what we're representing in our numbers. So that would be a very positive thing. The other way we look at this in some respects is we pay more attention to the revenues. In the past, there used to be some very tight relationships that we could draw upon. For example, the relationship between income tax withholding and wage and salary employment. You'd think those would be very closely linked to each other, because whatever you earn on your paycheck, the government takes the state takes 4.25% out of it and sends it, it gets sent in. And so you would think there would be a very, very close relationship. That relationship has fallen apart in recent years. And so instead, and quite frankly, the same thing with disposable income and sales tax revenue. People generally are not savers. They tend to spend what they have. And so to the extent that you have some disposable income, you spend it. And, for a number of years, we had a very tight relationship between what that was and what kind of sales tax that we had coming in the door. We're not seeing that as closely anymore. So I don't want to necessarily say that the economics are less important, but as we're focusing on the revenues, which is, I don't want to say the most important part of the revenue conference, but it's kind of what we're tasked with. We consider the economics as a stepping stone to get to where we're supposed to be, which is the revenues. And at this point, we're paying a little less attention to the economics because they just haven't been as good a forecaster of where the state has ended up. I mean, to the tune of the fact that we're $1.5 billion up in 22 relative to where we thought we'd been in May. And, nothing really substantial happened in that length of time. The stimulus was starting to wear down. We didn't see anything catastrophic hit. We did see we did see inflation, but so, it's a very long-winded way of saying we are looking at the economics, but probably we're tracking the revenues more closely. And that's why almost every month, we put out a revenue report that just updates things as to how, where we are this month, where we are relative to where we thought we'd be as far as our consensus estimates, and, trying to keep members up to date that way. So I don't know if that helps or not.
I appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome.
Next, we have a question by Rep. Britsky.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I have a question about the constitutional revenue limit history.
Yep.
Can you go to the dollar one and the previous one?
Yes.
And talk a little bit more about this and why it is bumping around, and the intention of this revenue limit.
I was around in 78 when all of this came into play. I wasn't at House Fiscal in 78, so I clearly was not involved in the discussions. But obviously, the constitutional revenue limit is simply designed to keep the state from amassing too much revenue from the public or from various state sources. It's akin in some respects to, for example, Colorado's TABOR, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, which limits revenue growth to 1% plus population plus inflation. And so the idea was that some amount of personal income at the state level, that percentage should be the maximum that the state should be allowed to take in. That any more than that was deemed to be excessive. This is one of the I think 5 different Headley amendments. Mm-hmm. And so I forget where in section or in where in Article 9 it is, but it's in section 20. It is section 26. So, but anyway, so it is set that 9.49. Now you won't find that in statute. The 9.49, you'll see a reference to the amount in I think it was 1978, but then there was a subsequent court case that altered that amount a little bit. So it is, practically it's 9.49%, but if you do a search on it, you won't find 9.49 anyplace. But that's what it is, and it was basically setting it at that 1978 level, and we've ventured along ever since. For what it's worth, I did just a little experiment 5-6 years ago where I compared the revenue limit to, well, what if we'd done something like a Taxpayer Bill of Rights? And the revenue limit has been actually far below that level. So I can't say in every year it was below, but in generally,
So going to the next slide.
Yep.
it seems like I've seen one before that instead of the percent, it has like dollar amount, which is
Right.
more. So what's the bar? How much
the-
money are we, what is that first bar below the red line? How much dollars is that approximately?
And unfortunately, I don't have those numbers in front of me. Well,
But you know
I do have them
approximately,
I do have
don't
them
you?
for the most
Yeah.
have them for the most recent consensus. I don't
Okay.
have, historically, I don't have them. But really what that's showing is, what the black line is showing is, if 9.49% of personal income is the most that the state can bring in, what percent of personal income is the state bringing in?
Right.
And so that's what that black line is showing, and you can see, that it's dropped down into the 8% or lower range. So
And it's post Proposal A, and that dip below on fiscal year '09 that you see that goes along with the Great Recession, and then again in '20 with the pandemic, really highlights something to me that the inability of our revenues to recover from these types of events because of Proposal A. So initially, the line would go up and down, up and down, up and down a lot more, and you would have recovery after those types of events because the initial drafting of that philosophy made it go both ways, right?
Right.
If you had times of great growth and increase in property values, and that it would cap it, but if you had the opposite, it would also go the other way.
Right.
And so this Proposal A has had this dramatic impact, and I kind of feel like the income tax trigger legislation that was put into place is going to exacerbate that in terms of having adequate revenues to provide the services that the state needs, that people rely on to function. And I think that there's a direct correlation between this constitutional revenue limit and the dramatic precipitous decline in our infrastructure and other important things in the state. I realize that's not a
Is
question.
that a question? Well,
I'm just making
I
a
guess-
statement here.
Okay. I guess one thing I would respond to is I would agree with you to some degree. I don't know how much because I haven't looked at it arithmetically on the impact of Proposal A, because when property values drop substantially, they don't immediately bounce back up again because the growth in taxable value is capped at either the rate of inflation or 5%, whichever's lower. And until recently, we were having relatively low periods of inflation, 2.5%. We had a couple years where we had negative inflation. So yes, I can see clearly in the case of Proposal A how when there's a drop in property values and then it takes a while to creep back up again, that I would say that probably affects local governments more than
Right.
the state because we have more resources to draw upon.
Right, but it also is going to impact the school aid fund
Sure.
dramatically.
Yep. So I would.
And the fact that it doesn't work in reverse,
correct.
right?
Yeah,
And-
it's a one-way street.
And the Headley Amendment was, and this income tax trigger is kind of the same thing. It doesn't work in reverse. It's like it doesn't recognize that you could have a bad economic time, and it doesn't allow any kind of recovery from that. I think it's bad governance.
I mean, that's the way it's written. I can't comment on it in a normative sense. The law is what it is to me. So,
Thank you, Mr. Stansel.
Rep. Van Winkle.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Quick one. In your view, when a tax trigger happens, is that a permanent change? And then associated with that, do you forecast another tax trigger event coming up?
My first response is, although I was raised in a family of lawyers, I am not an attorney and I don't play one on TV. So I'm not going to make an assessment as to whether or not it's a one-time drop or a permanent drop in the tax rate. That will be decided at pay grades much higher than mine. I will. Well, I'm going to step out on a limb here, and this is me. This is not House Fiscal. This is just me being back in the classroom. My sense is that it should be, and again, should not being what I would prefer it to be, but the way that it's written, I would interpret it to be a permanent rate cut. And the reason for that is when you do cut the rate, so for example, assuming the trigger to whatever degree it takes place, and we're still waiting for book closing to know what that is, but assuming that the trigger does take effect for tax year 23, we won't know what that is until sometime in March or April. And at that point, then the withholding tables the Treasury uses will be adjusted to reflect the lower income tax rate, and people will have less taken out of their paychecks than they were having taken out in January, February, and March. But there's no way to change what happened in January, February, and March, or certainly for the 22-23 fiscal year, the 4.25% that was active for the last 3 months of the fiscal year. So the point being is, if the goal of the trigger is to rid the state of excess revenue, the year that it takes effect can only be a partial year effect, because it's not in effect for the entire year. If it were to bounce back up to 4.25%, there would be no way to get rid of the excess revenue, because you'd be going back to a higher tax rate and we would start recouping it at the rate we were before. So that's my only logic as to whether or not it's a permanent or it's a one-time effect. But that's me, and as I said, I'm not an attorney and I don't parse these things at that level. So.
Do you anticipate another?
That's another good question. When the trigger was being discussed back in the 2014, 2015, and I tried to do some modeling of it and again, I wasn't trying to forecast growth 30 years out. I was just using standard growth rates and things like that. And the effect that I was seeing was you would hit the trigger, it had dropped the rate from 4.25 to 4.23, and then down to 4.22 the next year. And I'm kind of making up numbers, but this is kind of what I was seeing, because again, you can't get rid of the full amount in that first year. So typically there was a trigger in the second year as well, although albeit to a lesser degree. And then you would stabilize for a while, and then you would start to get growth, and you would hit the trigger again, and it might go down to 4.2 and then 4.19. And so you were getting subsequent events, although the magnitudes were much, much smaller. Here you've got really an outlier. You've got FY22 GF growth that doesn't really reflect the economics. It reflects the federal stimulus that was poured into the state, and as a result, I don't want to say it's artificially high, but again, we clearly weren't projecting that level of growth during any of our consensus conferences. And so, as a result, depending on how the trigger evolves this time around, and again, I don't know where book closing is going to be, but I think what you would see is a much larger decline in the tax rate than you would have seen when I was trying to model it 8 or 9 years ago, and probably will not see anything happening again, at least in the foreseeable future. We didn't explicitly talk about it at the revenue conference again because we didn't have what we needed, but I don't think any of the three agencies felt that if you do drop down to something in the mid-4 range, 4.05, 4.06, 4.04, wherever it ends up, that you would see another rate cut anytime soon.
See, is there any other questions?
Seeing there's no further business before this committee stands adjourned.